We really don't have a good playbook when it comes to negotiating the end of a conflict, especially when we are a direct participant. And then you look at our recent major interventions against insurgencies. So Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all three disasters. So one disaster is a horrible accident. Two disasters is a terrible trend. Three disasters is a pattern of behavior.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special episode of the Author Spotlight, a series of the University of South Florida's Global National Security Institute. I am Dr. David Oakley, the Academic Director for GNSI. And joining us today is Dr. Chris Kolenda, author of a new fascinating book called Zero-Sum Victory. Chris, thank you for joining us.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Dave.
Chris, we're going to start off, if you could tell us what motivated, inspired you to write this book, and a bit about yourself.
Well, what motivated me to write this book is I was pretty angry at, I just resigned from the government, so this is 2014, and I was the Secretary of Defense's personal representative in these talks we were having with the Taliban, and there was potential there to move forward a peace process, because everybody was in agreement that there was not going to be no military solution to the conflict. But nobody could quite agree what an alternative might look like. And so we, as a government, continued talking past one another. We really don't have a good playbook when it comes to negotiating the end of a conflict, especially when we are a direct participant. And then you look at our recent major interventions against insurgencies. So Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, all three disasters. So one disaster is a horrible accident. Two disasters is a terrible trend. Three disasters is a pattern of behavior. And that's what I wanted to uncover, is what is the pattern of behavior that we are displaying that is heightening the risks that these big interventions turn into quagmires.
So it sounds like you were inspired by your experience as a practitioner. So you want to explore it more as a scholar.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And King's College offered me an opportunity to come join the faculty as a practitioner. They wanted to put a practitioner on the faculty, and they said, "Hey, we'll waive the tuition on a PhD if you want to do that." And I said, "Yeah, actually, I'd like to do that." So it was the timing just worked out, and I was happy to have that opportunity.
Well, I like the title of the book. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about what you meant by zero-sum victory. It's tied to, you speak about war termination in the book. Speak about both those topics.
Right. So the term zero-sum victory is, the notion of zero-sum is we win everything and you gain nothing. So it's like the college football equivalent of war, where the belief is the game has to go on and on and on until somebody finally wins and somebody finally loses. So there's a 1 in somebody's win column and there's a 0 in somebody else's win column. And so that's the idea of zero-sum victory. It's an all or nothing proposition. And part of this is a hangover from World War II, where the belief that all wars must end in a surrender ceremony on a US battleship. And even though both World War II in Europe and in the Pacific entailed negotiations to bring those wars to an end, our popular mythology is this sort of unconditional surrender, zero-sum victory. And so when our going in proposition is we are going to gain a decisive zero-sum military victory, especially in these wars against insurgencies, it's inducing the three errors I mentioned in the book.
Do you think that the notion, I like the decisive victory, because, as a former military officer, I would hear decisive victory all the time.
Right.
Lieutenants were told, be decisive. Is it part of the American military culture, or is it part of the broader societal culture, or both?
Well, I think it's a bit of both.
Okay.
I mean, we couldn't tolerate college football when games would end in ties. We have to have a national champion. Baseball, can't possibly end in a tie. And so there's part of that kind of maximalist culture, and it's in part embedded in the military. So we have all of these sort of chest thumping terms like decisive victory, full spectrum dominance, and some of these other things, and so it's in part institutionalized in the military culture. And when civilian leaders look to military for advice, we will the military will tend to speak in this kind of terminology, and so it becomes self-reinforcing that we're going to have a zero-sum victory. And a lot of these conflicts, especially conflicts that turn on political legitimacy and not on battlefield outcomes, zero-sum victory tends not to be possible.
There was an interesting article back in, I think it was like 2007, and it was written by a behavioral economist that spoke about why hawks win, right?
Mm,
And one of the arguments they said is that policymakers like to hear decisiveness, all right? Like certainty. If we
right.
do A plus B plus C, we will achieve D. Do you think that's a little bit that the policymakers, it's music to the ears when military practitioners speak in this certain tones and this decisive, language?
We as human beings like to hear decisiveness and clarity. So when you look at any presidential campaign, you look at any marketing campaign, the simple, decisive answer or approach resonates much more than the more nuanced, well, if we do this, then it could have these kind of consequences. And so marketing campaigns doesn't work in marketing campaigns. And so it's a very similar issue. And so the more emphasis we place, of course, on military advice when it comes to war, and the military presents a game plan as very understandable and very certain, it can play into that. It can play into that mentality. At the same time, so one of the big errors that we make when we presume decisive military victory is that we can have this very military led centric approach to war. And so we start off, we know where we are, we have a pretty good idea of where we want to be, what success looks like, and what failure looks like. And of course, between where we are and those outcomes is the fog of war. So how do we deal with the fog of war? Well, we reverse engineer from the objective back to the start point. And that's what war planners do. And then we create these milestones along the way. And we think that if we hit these milestones, then it's going to lead us to success. And the problem is that war is not a complicated endeavor like that. It's a complex one, which means it's interwoven, which means other people have input. And that input shapes what happens. And so, as we saw in Vietnam, as we saw in Iraq, as we saw in Afghanistan, you can hit every single one of your milestones and be circling the drain towards failure.
Well, with those, your book does a great job looking at the case studies and laying out how the pursuit of zero-sum victory in Afghanistan and Iraq led to this. Could you delve into those case studies a little bit and just some highlights of the zero-sum victory mentality leading to failure in those places?
Right. Well, it starts right at the beginning. It's almost the fruit of or the poison fruit, if you will. So when we start off with zero-sum victory, we will tend to overemphasize military force. We'll then get stuck in a losing strategy because of things like cognitive bias. So we believe that because we're hitting these milestones, we're on an upward trajectory, and we refuse to look at data that says otherwise. We get stuck because of political and bureaucratic friction. So organizational silos, DoD and state don't speak the same language. and neither does the intel community, and then host nation entrapment. And so we get stuck, and the war is prolonging. We're paying penalties and public support along the way. And then when a president comes in and says, okay, we're done here, we're leaving, let's see if we can negotiate our way out, or let's see if we can transition to the host nation. Well, by that point, as soon as we announce we're leaving, we've lost all of our negotiating leverage. So the adversary is not going to negotiate an end to the conflict while we're still there. They're going to wait till we leave. The host nation is going to go kicking and screaming, won't want to do any negotiations, and in fact has an incentive to be as weak and as corrupt as possible to keep us entrapped. And so we wind up getting stuck, or we pull the plug and everything falls apart. So we saw that scenario repeat itself in those three conflicts.
It's interesting the way you describe the, our approach to where we're not really using war as a bargaining tool at the time, right? Just
Right.
the way we're handling it. So it goes back to your decisive victory, right?
Yeah, and there are different war termination scenarios. So zero-sum decisive victory is one scenario. So a mental image might be Gulf War I. That's pretty clear-cut military victory, even though we had some war termination challenges with that one as well. You can achieve your interests through a negotiated outcome. I mean, think of when you negotiate for a house or a car. You are achieving your interests through negotiations. You can do the same thing in war. We achieved our interests through negotiations after the Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Korean War. So that's another war termination scenario. And theoretically, you could, in an insurgency, if you're an intervening power, you can transition to that host nation. I'm not sure it's ever been done successfully. And then, of course, you could suffer a decisive loss. So those are some different war termination scenarios. But taking the three positive ones, if you're going for a zero-sum decisive military victory, then DoD is probably going to be in the lead. The military force is going to be your lead actor. If you're looking for a negotiated outcome, your diplomats are going to be your lead actor with military force in support of that. So your strategy is going to look very, very different. If you believe that the host nation should take over, and so you have a transition approach, well, then you are going to use military force and you're going to use negotiations as instruments to boost host nation legitimacy. But your primacy is going to be on good governance, anti-corruption, and those sorts of things that help the host nation be in a position to take over security responsibility. So depending on your war termination desired outcome, you have very different strategies. And it's something that we haven't come to grips with.
It sounds like really when you have that discussion on war termination before the war, there has to be a collaborative discussion about what is actually achievable,
right,
with all these different organizations participating.
You're exactly right. And one of the things I found very interesting, look at a lot of the longitudinal studies on insurgencies and counterinsurgencies, is since World War II, and just about every conflict, an insurgency that has had external sanctuary and enough indigenous support to field a team has been successful every single time. By contrast, a host nation government that has been unable to win the battle of legitimacy, which you can test through, are they able to retake and retain insurgent-controlled territory? If they can't retake and retain insurgent-controlled territory, they have been unsuccessful every single time. And so one of the things I put in the book is I call the critical factors framework. I mean, we measure a lot of things, how many soldiers we've trained and civil servants we've trained and paved roads and schools built, et cetera. None of that's relevant in terms of like the outcome of the war and our war termination scenario. What's really relevant is, does the insurgency have sustainable support? And is the host nation able to win the battle of legitimacy in the eyes of its own people? And so you do a very simple double axis chart. And your only decisive victory scenario is when the insurgency does not have sustainable support. So there's no sanctuary, and they have a hard time fielding a team, and the host nation government is seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people. That's the only part of that double axis, the only quadrant where zero-sum decisive victory is possible. So like the Boer War, for instance, where the Boers had no external sanctuary, you could isolate them. The rest of the country, they had was legitimate in the eyes of the people, and so you could get a decisive victory against the Boers, for instance. Afghanistan, Iraq, Vietnam, not that scenario. In both cases, or in all three cases, we had the exact opposite. We had sustainable insurgencies and host nations that were not seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people. So it's like blowing a candle with both ends with a blowtorch, and the results were actually fairly predictable from that.
And one of the things I really liked about the book is you didn't just offer a critique. You provide some recommendations. You gave 7 recommendations. Could you go through some of those and describe the recommendations for us?
Well, one of the things that we've got to fix, and unfortunately, all 7 of these recommendations are fairly low cost and high payoff. So the key is we want to reduce the risk of making the same unforced errors that we've made in the 3 conflicts that resulted in these quagmires. So these are complex endeavors. The enemy's got to vote. The host nation's got to vote. Regional actors have, there's an interplay there. So just fixing these things isn't going to be a panacea, but it's going to reduce our unforced errors, which is very important. So one of the unforced errors that we have is we don't have a common national security dictionary. So the same words don't mean the same things to people in different agencies. The term defeat, classic example. First of all, we have no strategic definition of defeat. The Department of Defense has a tactical definition of defeat, which is that the enemy is no longer able to pursue their chosen course of action. Defeat to everybody outside the Department of Defense means like zero-sum victory, it means eradication. It means, you've eliminated them. And in Afghanistan, there was a huge civil-military debate, controversy over the term defeat. And I write about it in the book where President Obama had asked General McChrystal, what is your mission in Afghanistan? He says, it's to defeat the Taliban. In his mind, they can't pursue their chosen course of action, which is overthrowing the government. But everybody else took it as, well, this is the military wanting to eradicate the Taliban, and this is an effort to box the president into a massive troop surge. Reconciliation was another one that there's no common terminology for it, and so you had about 4 different definitions of reconciliation happening in the U.S. government at the same time, and so everybody's talking past each other with these false cognates or these terms that mean different things. So the first one is, let's get a standard strategic dictionary, policy level dictionary that governs U.S. national security agencies. You could probably write it up in, 48 hours. And then at least you've got people using the same terms to mean the same thing.
A common lexicon.
Common lexicon.
Okay.
Related to that is a common playbook on war termination. So, there are 3 basic ways that wars end successfully: decisive victory, negotiated outcome, transition if it's an intervention. So, and there are different strategies that bring those about. and developing a playbook for those that helps the interagency see how they work together to achieve those outcomes and to achieve our policy aims is vital. We don't have any of that. We don't have any expert body of knowledge on how to negotiate an end to the conflict, particularly when we are direct participants. So, which is part of the reason why our negotiations in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, we didn't do any negotiations in Iraq except with the host nation government, were problematic. Weren't very successful at all, especially when you look at Afghanistan. So we've got to do a much better job there. And again, this is the expertise is there to be able to do this. It's just a matter of will of getting it done. We need to make a differentiation between when it comes to war, between war fighting and war waging. War fighting is what the military does. It's their professional expertise. It's the clash of military forces. War waging sits above that. And it's the integration of all elements of national power to achieve your aims. The military is one element of that national power. You've got state, you've got the intelligence community, you've got treasury, you've got other elements of national power. And war waging, we don't have any war waging doctrine, we don't have any war waging playbook for how we bring these elements of national power together. And so what happens is the president turns to the military, says, give me options. Once you've done that, you've just militarized all of the options. And you've handcuffed, the president's handcuffed, himself or herself to a military-centric approach that might not be appropriate.
One of the things on those three areas I took away from the book, and I really appreciated it, the common lexicon, the war termination, and the whole of government approach. There's so much relevance, I think, for strategic competition, because the same failures
Right.
we have to orchestrate, American power and capability that's present in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would argue is present today in the way that we approach China.
Right. Yeah, and I remember we had this term, gray zone conflict. And it was attributed to how the Russians would nefariously use, cyber and propaganda and diplomacy and economics as instruments of war. And it's like, that's not gray zone conflict. That's conflict. And that is using your elements of national power strategically. And the fact that this was such a surprise to us, I find really, really disturbing, because we ought to be doing the same thing, but we don't. We've got an oversized military portion of the effort, and we've got other elements of national power sort of cheering on the military effort. And here's how I'll support you, but it shouldn't be like that. When the president says, we have a conflict, I want options, president shouldn't turn to the Secretary of Defense. President should turn to the National Security Advisor and say, I want three options. I want a military-led option, I want a diplomacy-led option, and an option that's maybe led by somebody else, or an option for negotiations, versus an option that uses military force, versus an option for a frozen conflict, achieving a frozen conflict. Okay, now you got something to work with. And now the president can have three very distinct options based on different war termination scenarios. When President Obama asked for options for the troop surge in Afghanistan, he turned to the military. And so what's the military going to give him? Well, okay, the military can't speak for state, can't speak for treasury, can't speak for the IC. So they're going to say, okay, military options, big, medium, and little. And that's what he got. Instead of getting an option for to seek a military outcome to the conflict, could have been one option. A second option could have been, let's seek a negotiated outcome to the conflict. Third option could have been, let's seek a a transition. What do those strategies look like? Now you can evaluate different things instead of just something based on different troop levels.
And that's kind of tied to, one of your other recommendations, I'll just read it. Right sides the military's role in the policy and strategy process so the president receives integrated rather than military-centric options. One of the thoughts I was reading that is, who's responsible for the oversized influence of the military in strategy? Is it policymakers who resource the different institutions? Is it Department of Defense arguing for more? Is it, both?
I think it's one of those implicit assumptions that we have within our national security architecture. So I don't think the military is consciously wanting to play an outsized role. Even in Afghanistan, the people who are arguing the most for a negotiated outcome was the military. It wasn't the State Department. It was the military. And so, but we have these embedded assumptions that I think are very, very important to unravel. And when we do that and we take a more integrated approach to developing policy options, the president's going to have actual options to choose from and not just big, medium, and little.
I want to shift a little bit. One of the other areas you focused on, you had a recommendation, was the patron-client problems. Could you talk a little bit about what you mean by that?
Yeah, patron-client is a social science term for the relationship between the host nation and the intervening power. So patron in these cases would be United States. Client would be the host nation governments of Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so part of the challenge in the patron-client relationships is each one is going to do what they think is best for themselves, and there's not necessarily an agreement on what's best overall. There's not necessarily agreement on objectives. So each has their own objective. And so you'll get challenges like when it comes to negotiations, the host nation is always going to be the one going kicking and screaming because they believe that they've got the most to lose. You saw this in Vietnam, you saw this in Afghanistan, where the host nation was the most reluctant, because if there's a negotiated outcome, then somehow you're going to have to bring the other side into the government. And so, okay, well, who's going to lose out? In that case, or can you grow the pie big enough to include everybody? But we're not thinking in those sort of terms. The host nation often has incentives to be as corrupt as possible because you don't know whether this is going to be successful or not. And so each of these countries developed into kleptocracies, from the ancient Greek, literally meaning government of thieves. And so they use official positions for personal gain. So I'm not talking just taking like the occasional bribe. I'm talking engagement in land theft, kidnapping for ransom, black market trade. In Afghanistan, it was gems and timber, opium, extorting our aid and development dollars, misappropriating our aid and development dollars. At one point, capital flight out of Afghanistan was $5 billion. And these are all super empowered individuals or government officials who are hedging against the future. And so the more corrupt they are, the better they can hedge against the future. If things fall apart, they've got a golden parachute. The problem is the more corrupt they are, the more that they push their own citizens into the arms of the insurgents who are then trying to kill our soldiers. So those are some of the patron-client problems that we consistently see. and we need to start wising up to and guarding against.
One of the things in your book that I found interesting and I agreed with, you not only spoke about some of the organizational change, some of the way to approach war termination, but you seem to touch on some of the attributes of the individual practitioner. So you talked about the importance of getting away from confirmation bias, the importance of empathy. Can you describe a little bit about those kind of attributes and the importance of them in what we're discussing?
Yeah, so for instance, confirmation bias is the tendency to place weight on data that confirms your pre-existing point of view and to discount data or information that contradicts that point of view. So for instance, we're meeting all these milestones. So we've created these milestones along the way to success. We're meeting all the milestones: interim government, constitution, presidential election, economic plan, military force established, etc. And our confirmation bias says, okay, we're actually heading towards success. And the administrations are briefing people, the American people. We're making progress. And everybody looks at the situation and says, no, we're not. We're circling the drain. We're actually going downhill. And so what's happening is people they've got this pre-existing belief that meeting these milestones is going to lead to success, when actually what's been happening is we've got a case where the host nation is not legitimate. The insurgency has got internal support, external sanctuary, which means not going to get a decisive victory. Things are going downhill at this point, and then we got these other problems, confirmation bias, et cetera, that we're facing, and but we're just not seeing it. Now the public is seeing it, but the practitioners aren't seeing it. They're believing their own press. They're believing that their strategy is working, and at some point it becomes so painfully obvious that it's not. That's when the president says, "Okay, this isn't working. We need to leave, and let's try to negotiate." And we've lost all our leverage.
Sounds like we really need to also focus on how we nurture a more critical practitioner that can understand some of these tendencies towards confirmation bias, or maybe not being empathetic enough to do other perspectives or host nation.
Right, and just being able to see the incentives from somebody else's point of view. And I mean, folks aren't in these host nations aren't bad people. I mean, some are. Most are average people just trying to hedge against the future. But if we don't get that and don't get the incentives that they're operating under, then we tend to mirror image. So we have a very strong civilian control of the military tradition. We have a very strong tradition about the military as a profession, and what Huntington calls the objective control of the military. Most of the world doesn't work like that. Most of the world is subjective control of the military, where the political leaders use military forces as instruments of political power. They want to protect themselves against coups. One of the best ways is to enrich the people with the guns. And you do that by allowing them to run amok among the population, which then creates this sort of backlash effect. But if we don't see this and recognize that it's likely to happen, then we wind up looking like we're complicit in the problem in the eyes of the people.
Well, Chris, I tell you, it's an excellent book. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's very helpful for practitioners thinking about strategic competition, thinking about strategy more broadly, not just at war. And I commend you on the publication, and yeah, thank you for contributing the knowledge, and understanding, and for joining us today.
Absolutely, it's my pleasure, and I hope this book will help institute some of those low cost, high payoff reforms. When you look at a lot of our conflicts, there's actually nobody on the ground in charge of our wars. We're actually operating in these silos, and so you've got the military in its silo, state in its silo, the IC in their silos, and on the ground, there's nobody who's actually in charge of all the elements of national power. And the lowest ranking person that all of those people report to is the President of the United States. You can't run a war like that, at least not one of these small wars. And so that's another easy place for reform.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. It was great chatting with you.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks. I want to thank our special guest today, Chris Kolenda, author of the book Zero Sum Victory, published by the University Press of Kentucky in 2021. You can find the book at your favorite bookstore, and you'll also find the link at the end of the podcast today. Thank you for joining us on the Author Spotlight. Hope to see you soon.